Most people think power lives in words. They believe the more you speak, the more visible you become. The more you explain, the more intelligent you sound. The louder you are, the more important you must be. But life teaches a different lesson. The people with the most influence in the room are rarely the ones talking the most. They speak less, and when they finally do, the room shifts. People lean in. Silence forms. Attention sharpens, because intelligence doesn't rush to be heard. It waits. If you've ever wondered why certain people command respect without raising their voice, why their words land heavier, why they don't feel the need to fill every pause, this audiobook is for you. In this audiobook, Smart People Don't Talk Much, you'll discover why restraint is not weakness, why silence can be strategic, and why the smartest communicators in the world choose their words like currency. Here's the truth most people never hear. Talking less isn't about being shy. It's not about being passive. And it's definitely not about lacking confidence. It's about control. Control over attention. Control over perception. Control over meaning. The loudest person in the room is often the most uncertain. The calmest voice is often the sharpest mind. And here's a line worth remembering. Smart people don't speak to be noticed. They speak when they have something that changes the room. Think about this. How many times have you spoken just to avoid silence? How often have you explained too much hoping to be understood, only to feel weaker afterward? How many conversations ended with you thinking, I should have said less? This audiobook will change how you communicate forever. Not by teaching you fancy vocabulary, not by turning you into someone you're not, but by showing you why fewer words create more power. Over the next chapters, you'll learn why intelligent people pause before speaking and what that pause signals psychologically, why silence makes others reveal more than words ever could, why explaining too much lowers perceived status, why smart people let others talk themselves into clarity, and how to speak in a way that feels effortless, calm, and authoritative. This is not about manipulation, it's about precision, because every word you say either raises your influence or leaks it. Most people leak. Smart people conserve. Now listen closely. When you talk constantly, you give people nothing to wonder about. When you speak sparingly, your words carry mystery. Mystery creates interest. Interest creates respect. This is why intelligent people don't rush to respond. They observe first. They listen longer than others. They let conversations reveal themselves before stepping in. And when they do speak, they don't compete. They conclude. Silence is not empty. Silence is a filter. It separates impulse from intention. Now ask yourself something honestly. What would change in your life if you spoke only when it mattered? If you removed unnecessary words, unnecessary explanations, unnecessary reactions? What would people think of you if your voice was rare, calm, and deliberate? You already know the answer. This journey begins with one uncomfortable realization. Most people talk to feel safe. Smart people stay quiet until their words are inevitable. In the next chapter, you'll learn why intelligence listens longer than it speaks, and how silence becomes a psychological advantage in every conversation you enter. Stay with me, because once you understand this, you'll never rush to speak again. Part 2. Why intelligence listens longer than it speaks. Most people listen to reply. Smart people listen to understand. That difference is invisible on the surface, but obvious in impact. When someone speaks too quickly, too often, too eagerly, they reveal something without realizing it. They're not present. They're waiting for their turn. Intelligent people don't do that. They slow the conversation down. They let others talk themselves into clarity. Because here's a truth most people miss. The person who listens controls the direction of the conversation. Now think about the last time you felt truly heard. The other person wasn't interrupting. They weren't rushing. They weren't stacking responses in their head. They were calm, still, attentive. That presence felt powerful. That's not accidental. That's intelligence in action. Smart people understand that information flows towards silence. When you talk less, others talk more. When others talk more, they reveal what they care about, what they fear, what they want, where they're unsure. That information is priceless, and the smartest communicators gather it quietly. Now listen carefully. Every conversation has two layers: what is being said and what is being revealed. Most people only hear the words. Smart people hear patterns, tone shifts, pauses, over-explaining, defensiveness. Silence gives you access to all of it. Now here's something important. Talking too much feels like confidence, but real confidence is comfort with silence. If silence makes you uncomfortable, it's not because silence is awkward, it's because you're afraid of losing relevance. Smart people aren't afraid of that. They know relevance comes from timing, not volume. They don't jump in immediately. They let moments breathe. And when they do respond, their words feel measured. Intentional. Now think about this. In meetings, who seems most powerful? The person filling every gap with words, or the person who speaks twice, but both times changes the direction of the room? You already know the answer. Smart people don't interrupt momentum, they redirect it. Now let's talk about questions. Intelligent people ask better questions than they give answers. Because questions do three things at once. They show curiosity, they shift focus, they invite others to think a well-placed question can carry more authority than a long explanation. That's why smart people don't rush to explain. They ask, and then they listen. Now pause. How often do you feel the urge to jump in before the other person finishes? That urge is impulse. Impulse weakens communication. Restraint strengthens it. Smart people master restraint. They let silence do the work. Now here's a line worth remembering. If you talk too soon, you speak without leverage. Leverage comes from information. Information comes from listening. This is why intelligent people are rarely caught off guard in conversations. They already know what's happening. They've been paying attention while others were talking. In the next chapter, we'll go deeper. You'll learn why explaining too much lowers perceived intelligence, and why smart people let their words end conversations, not extend them. This is where communication starts to feel effortless. Part 3. Why smart people don't explain themselves. One of the fastest ways to lower your perceived intelligence is to explain too much. Most people don't realize this. They think clarity comes from more words. They think respect comes from justification. They think understanding comes from over-detailing. But socially, psychologically, the opposite is true. The more you explain, the more you look uncertain. Smart people understand this instinctively. They don't rush to defend their position. They don't over-clarify every sentence. They don't chase agreement because they know something important. Confidence doesn't need explanation. Now listen carefully. When you over-explain, you send an invisible signal. I'm not sure you'll accept this. I'm not sure I'm right. I need you to understand me for this to work. That signal weakens your words. Smart people remove that signal. They state, they pause. They let the statement stand on its own. And if someone misunderstands, they don't panic. They allow space, because not everything needs correction. Now think about this. Have you ever watched someone explain themselves into a corner? They start strong, then add details, then add more, then clarify the clarification. By the end, their original point is gone. Not because it was wrong, but because they diluted it. Smart people compress. They say the core, then they stop. Now here's the key idea. Explanations are for teaching, not for asserting. Smart people separate the two. When they're teaching, they explain clearly and calmly. When they're asserting, they don't. They trust their words to land without padding. Now let's talk about silence after speaking. This is where most people break. They say something important, then feel the urge to fill the silence. So they add, they soften, they backtrack, they qualify. Smart people don't do this. They speak, then go quiet. That silence does something powerful. It forces the listener to process. It shifts attention. It elevates the statement. Silence after speaking is confidence. Now pause. Think about the last time you said something important. Did you let it land, Or did you rush to make it comfortable? Comfort is not the goal of powerful communication. Clarity is. Smart people are comfortable being misunderstood temporarily because they know clarity reveals itself over time. Now listen closely. You don't need everyone to understand you immediately. You need the right people to understand you eventually. That mindset removes the pressure to over-explain. Now here's a line worth remembering. If your words are strong, let them stand alone. Smart people trust the weight of what they say. They don't stack words on top of words. They allow space. And space creates authority. In the next chapter, we'll explore something deeper. Why silence makes others project intelligence onto you, and how the human brain fills gaps with respect when you don't rush to fill them yourself. This is where communication becomes psychological. Part 4. Why silence makes you sound smarter. Silence makes most people uncomfortable. That discomfort is exactly why it works. When you leave space after you speak, or choose not to speak at all, the human mind reacts automatically. It fills the gap. And what it fills the gap with is interpretation. Smart people understand this. They don't rush to define themselves. They don't rush to clarify every thought. They allow others to assign meaning. And here's the psychological truth. People project intelligence onto what they don't fully understand. When you explain everything, there is nothing left to interpret. When you leave space, the mind assumes depth. This is not manipulation. It's human perception. Now think about authority figures you've encountered. They didn't talk constantly. They didn't fill silence nervously. They were comfortable letting pauses exist. That comfort signals confidence, and confidence signals intelligence. Now listen carefully. Silence does 3 powerful things at once. It slows the conversation. It centers attention on you. It forces others to process. Most people are afraid of that moment. They rush to escape it. Smart people stay inside it, because that moment is leverage. Now let's talk about reaction time. When someone says something challenging, unexpected, or emotional, most people respond immediately. They defend. They react. They justify. Smart people pause. That pause communicates, I'm not threatened. I'm thinking. I don't need to rush. That alone raises perceived intelligence. Now pause. Think about how often you answer immediately, even when you don't need to. That speed doesn't impress. It exposes anxiety. Smart people let the pause do the work. Now here's an important distinction. Silence is not absence. It's presence without noise. You're still engaged, still attentive, still in control. You're just not leaking words. Now let's talk about restraint. Restraint is the quiet sibling of discipline. And in communication, restraint is rare. That's why it's powerful. Most people speak to relieve tension. Smart people tolerate tension. They know tension makes others lean in. Now listen closely. If you speak only when you have something valuable to add, people start assigning value to everything you say. That's the compounding effect of silence. Fewer words, more weight. Now here's a line worth remembering. When you don't rush to fill silence, silence works for you. In the next chapter, we'll explore why smart people don't try to win conversations. They don't dominate. They don't overpower. They let others reach conclusions themselves, and that changes how influence actually works. Part 5. Why smart people don't try to win conversations. Most people enter conversations trying to win. They want to be right. They want to sound impressive. They want the last word. And without realizing it, they turn communication into competition. Smart people don't do this because they understand something subtle, but powerful. The person trying to win the conversation usually loses influence. Now listen carefully. When you try to win, you reveal need. Need to be validated. Need to be seen as correct. Need to dominate. That need weakens your position. Smart people don't need to win conversations. They let conversations arrive at conclusions. There's a difference. Most people argue. Smart people guide. Now think about this. Have you ever watched someone talk themselves into agreement? They start unsure. They explain. They clarify. They reason out loud. and suddenly, they reach the conclusion themselves. That's influence, and it only happens when you don't interrupt the process. Smart people allow others to finish their thoughts, even when they're wrong, especially when they're wrong, because correcting too early robs people of insight. Now here's the psychological truth. People trust conclusions they reach themselves more than conclusions handed to them. Smart people use this. They don't overpower with logic. They ask questions. They pause. They let silence pressure reflection. Now pause. Think about how often you jump in to correct someone immediately. That impulse comes from ego. Smart people manage ego. They don't need to prove intelligence. They demonstrate it through patience. Now listen closely. Influence doesn't come from speaking louder. It comes from speaking last, not literally, strategically. Smart people wait until the conversation reveals itself. Then they add one sentence that reframes everything. That sentence lands heavier than 10 explanations. Now here's a line worth remembering. Winning the room is more powerful than winning the argument. Smart people focus on the room, energy, direction, tone. They don't get pulled into emotional sparring. They stay calm. And calm is contagious. Now let's talk about disagreement. Smart people disagree quietly. They don't attack. They don't escalate. They don't perform dominance. They say things like, "That's one way to see it. I see it differently. Interesting perspective." And then they pause. That pause creates space for reflection, not resistance. Now ask yourself honestly, how many arguments have you won, but lost connection? Smart people don't make that trade. They understand that influence survives relationships, not debates. Now listen carefully. You don't need to convince everyone. You need to remain respected. Respect lasts longer than agreement. In the next chapter, we'll explore why smart people choose precision over personality in speech, and how fewer, sharper words create lasting authority. This is where communication becomes an asset instead of a habit. Part 6. Precision over personality. Most people confuse personality with presence. They think being expressive makes them interesting. They think talking more makes them memorable. They think charisma comes from constant engagement. Smart people know something different. Presence comes from precision. It's not about how much you say. It's about how accurately your words land. Personality is loud. Precision is sharp. And sharpness leaves marks. Now listen carefully. When someone speaks constantly, their words blend together. Nothing stands out, nothing sticks. But when someone speaks rarely and precisely, each sentence feels intentional. That intention is felt immediately. Smart people don't decorate their speech. They remove excess. They cut unnecessary adjectives. They avoid filler phrases. They don't speak just to maintain momentum. They let words earn their place. Now think about this. Have you ever heard someone say very little, but every sentence felt finished? No wandering, no over-explaining, no emotional spillover, just clarity. That's precision, and precision signals intelligence. Now let's talk about why this works psychologically. The brain associates clarity with competence. When someone speaks cleanly, the mind assumes they think cleanly. When someone rambles, the mind assumes confusion, even if the idea is good. Smart people respect the listener's attention. They don't waste it. Now pause. Think about how often you add words not because they add meaning, but because silence feels uncomfortable. Those words dilute your message. Smart people are ruthless with dilution. They prefer one sentence that lands over 10 that drift. Now listen closely. Precision doesn't mean coldness. It means control. Control over emotion, control over timing, control over direction. Smart people can be warm without being messy, engaging without being excessive, clear without being rigid. That balance is rare. That rarity creates authority. Now let's talk about tone. Precision affects tone automatically. When your words are chosen carefully, your tone slows down, your voice steadies, your presence deepens. People listen differently because they sense deliberateness. Now here's a line worth remembering. When every word matters, every word carries weight. Smart people don't perform intelligence. They let it emerge through restraint. In the next chapter, we'll explore why smart people end conversations early, why they don't linger, and how leaving first quietly raises status. This is where silence becomes strategic. Part 7. Why smart people know when to stop talking. Most people think conversations end when there is nothing left to say. Smart people end conversations before that point. Not abruptly, not rudely, but deliberately, because they understand something subtle. The last impression lasts the longest. If you linger too long, you dilute impact. If you keep talking, you soften authority. If you overstay, you slide from presence into noise. Smart people don't do that. They exit while their words still carry weight. Now listen carefully. There's a moment in every conversation when attention peaks. The point where ideas are clear. Energy is focused. Respect is intact. Smart people recognize that moment. And they leave. Not physically every time, sometimes mentally. They stop adding. They stop explaining. They stop reacting. They let the conversation rest on what was said. Now think about this. Have you ever walked away from a conversation thinking, that ended strong? That feeling doesn't come from more words. It comes from timing. Smart people master timing. Now here's the psychology. When you stop talking first, people keep thinking about what you said. When you keep talking, they stop thinking and start waiting. Waiting drains influence. Thinking deepens it. Smart people choose thinking. Now let's talk about status. High-status individuals don't linger. They don't hover. They don't fill silence out of politeness. They don't over-engage to prove interest. They engage fully, then disengage cleanly. That rhythm feels confident. Now pause. How often do you keep talking simply because you don't know how to stop? That's not communication. That's anxiety. Smart people are comfortable with endings. They don't need to squeeze every ounce out of an interaction. They trust what's already been said. Now listen closely. Ending a conversation early doesn't mean cutting people off. It means recognizing completion. It means knowing when the point has landed. It means understanding that less interaction can create more impact. Now here's a line worth remembering. Powerful people don't exhaust conversations. They conclude them. Now think about the opposite. People who talk until there's nothing left. They drain rooms. They lose attention. They weaken presence. Smart people avoid that fate. They preserve energy, theirs and others. Now let's talk about emotional control. Ending conversations early prevents emotional leakage. The longer conversations go, the more emotions slip out. Smart people limit exposure. They don't stay long enough to overreact. They don't stay long enough to overshare. They don't stay long enough to lose composure. That restraint protects intelligence. Now ask yourself honestly, what would happen if you stopped conversations sooner? If you said less? If you exited earlier? If you trusted silence to finish the work? Your presence would rise, not because you spoke better, but because you spoke enough. In the next chapter, we'll explore why smart people rarely react immediately, and how delayed responses increase perceived intelligence and emotional control. This is where patience becomes power. Part 8. The power of delayed response. Speed is overrated. Most people believe quick responses signal intelligence. That answering immediately shows confidence. That silence after a question means weakness. Smart people know the opposite is true. Delay signals depth. Now listen carefully. When you respond instantly, you react from impulse, from emotion, from habit. When you pause, you respond from intention. That pause does something powerful psychologically. It communicates, I'm not rushed. I'm considering. I don't need to fill space. And that calm restraint raises perceived intelligence instantly. Now think about the most composed people you know. They don't rush answers. They don't jump at every comment. They don't feel pressured to respond immediately. They let moments breathe. That breathing space is authority. Now let's talk about emotional control. Immediate responses are emotional responses. Delayed responses are regulated responses. Smart people regulate first, then speak. They don't allow surprise, irritation, or excitement to hijack their words. They pause. They collect themselves. They choose tone before content. That's why they rarely say things they regret. Now pause. How many times have you spoken too quickly and wished you could pull the words back? That doesn't happen when you slow down. Now listen closely. Delaying a response doesn't mean being passive. It means being selective. You decide, is this worth engaging? Is this worth responding to now? Is silence the stronger move? Often, silence is. Now here's a psychological truth. When you delay, others assume you're thinking deeply. When you rush, others assume you're reacting emotionally. Perception matters. Smart people manage perception through timing. Now think about high-stakes environments, negotiations, leadership meetings, difficult conversations. The person who speaks first rarely controls the outcome. The person who waits does. They gather information. They observe reactions. They sense direction. Then they speak. Now here's a line worth remembering. Speed impresses beginners. Restraint impresses experts. Smart people play the long game. They don't rush to be clever. They allow clarity to emerge. Now let's talk about delayed responses digitally. Messages, emails, texts. Smart people don't respond immediately to everything. They create space, not to play games, but to maintain control. Immediate availability lowers perceived value. Measured response raises it. Now pause. What would change if you stopped responding instantly? If you let messages sit? If you let conversations breathe? If you trusted silence? Your stress would drop. Your words would sharpen. Your presence would grow. Now understand this. Silence is not avoidance. It's selection. Smart people choose their moments. In the next chapter, we'll explore why smart people speak less about themselves and why self-restraint and self-disclosure quietly elevates status. This is where communication becomes elegance. Part 9. Why smart people don't talk about themselves much. Most people believe talking about themselves builds connection. They think sharing stories creates rapport, that explaining their background earns respect, that highlighting achievements establishes credibility. Smart people know something counterintuitive. The more you talk about yourself, the less powerful you sound. Now listen carefully. Self-disclosure feels honest. It feels open. It feels human. But excessive self-disclosure shifts attention away from intelligence and toward validation. Smart people don't need validation through speech. They let results and restraint speak instead. Now think about high-status individuals. They rarely lead with their credentials. They don't list achievements. They don't dominate conversations with personal stories. And yet, everyone knows they're competent. Why? Because confidence doesn't announce itself. It shows up as restraint. Now here's the psychological truth. When you talk a lot about yourself, you're asking others to evaluate you. When you talk less, others evaluate you automatically, and usually favorably. Smart people let perception work for them. They don't force narratives. They allow curiosity. Curiosity is far more powerful than explanation. Now pause. Think about someone who rarely talks about themselves, yet seems respected. That respect wasn't earned through disclosure. It was earned through presence. Now listen closely. Smart people redirect attention outward. They ask questions. They listen deeply. They let others feel seen. And something interesting happens. People associate that good feeling with intelligence, because intelligence is not just thinking well. It's making others think clearly. Now let's talk about oversharing. Oversharing weakens authority, not because vulnerability is bad, but because timing matters. Smart people choose when to share, not how much. They don't unload. They don't vent publicly. They don't narrate their struggles unnecessarily. They process privately. Then, if they share, they do so with purpose. Now here's a line worth remembering. Mystery raises perceived intelligence. Oversharing dissolves it. Smart people allow mystery. They don't fill every gap in their story. They leave room for interpretation. Now let's talk about ego. Talking about yourself often comes from ego, or insecurity disguised as openness. Smart people manage ego. They don't need to be central in every conversation. They let others shine. And paradoxically, that makes them more noticeable. Now pause. How often do you speak just to be seen? What would change if you spoke only when your words added value, not visibility? Your communication would sharpen instantly. In the next chapter, we'll explore why smart people observe social dynamics quietly, how they read rooms without speaking, and why awareness beats expression every time. This is where intelligence becomes situational mastery. Part 10. How smart people read the room without speaking. Before smart people speak, they already know what's happening. Not because they're psychic, because they observe. While others are talking, reacting, performing, smart people are reading the room. Energy, tension, hierarchy, unspoken dynamics. They understand something most people miss. Communication is happening even when no one is talking. Now listen carefully. Every room has a temperature. Who's relaxed? Who's defensive? Who's seeking approval? Who's holding power? Most people walk into rooms blind. They start talking immediately. They reveal their position. They give away leverage. Smart people wait. They watch who interrupts whom, who speaks confidently, who over-explains, who avoids eye contact, who listens. This information is more valuable than words. Now think about this. Have you ever noticed someone who says very little, yet always seems one step ahead socially? They're not lucky. They're aware. Smart people treat rooms like systems. They don't jump in before understanding the structure. They learn who influences decisions, who reacts emotionally, who is insecure, who is respected. Then, and only then, they speak. Now here's the psychological truth. The person who understands the room controls the room, not through dominance, through timing. Smart people choose when to speak based on context. They don't say smart things at the wrong time. They say simple things at the right time. That's intelligence. Now pause. How often do you speak without understanding the environment you're in? Meetings, social settings, family conversations. Smart people adjust. They don't sound the same everywhere. They don't perform a fixed personality. They adapt. Adaptability is intelligence. Now listen closely. Smart people don't react to surface behavior. They notice patterns, repeated interruptions, repeated defensiveness, repeated silence. Patterns tell you more than words ever will. Now let's talk about emotional undercurrents. Rooms carry emotion, tension, excitement, resistance, fatigue. Smart people feel these undercurrents and align with them. They don't fight the mood, they work with it. That alignment makes their words land. Now here's a line worth remembering. Speak to the moment, not to the script. Smart people don't recite opinions. They respond to context. Now imagine this. You walk into a room. You don't rush to speak. You observe. You sense. You wait. Then you speak once, and everyone listens. Not because you spoke louder, but because you spoke at the right moment. In the final chapter, we bring everything together. Not tactics, not tricks, but a shift in identity. Why smart people don't try to talk less. They simply don't feel the need to talk more. This is where silence becomes natural. Part 11. When talking less becomes who you are. At a certain point, something shifts. You stop trying to talk less. You simply don't feel the need to talk more. This is the final stage. Not a technique, not a strategy, an identity. Smart people are not quiet because they're holding back. They're quiet because they're complete. They don't speak to fill gaps. They don't speak to feel important. They don't speak to manage perception. They speak when words are necessary and stay silent when they're not. And that silence is not empty. It's full of awareness. Now listen carefully. When you no longer feel the urge to explain yourself, to prove yourself, to narrate your thoughts, you gain something rare. Inner stability. That stability is what others sense. That's why smart people don't perform intelligence. They embody it. Now think about how much energy most people waste talking. Talking to release tension, talking to avoid discomfort, talking to stay visible, talking to feel included. Smart people process internally first. They think before they speak. They reflect before they react. They understand before they comment. And because of that, when they speak, it lands. Now here's the deepest truth of this audiobook. Talking less is not about words. It's about self-trust. When you trust your thoughts, you don't rush them out. When you trust your value, you don't announce it. When you trust your presence, you don't fill silence. Smart people trust themselves. Now pause. Notice how different it feels to imagine living this way. Slower, calmer, more grounded. You don't feel behind. You don't feel pressured. You don't feel the need to impress. You're present. Now understand this. Silence does not make you invisible. It makes you legible. People can read you more clearly. They sense consistency. They feel composure. And composure is magnetic. Now let me leave you with something important. You don't need to change your personality to speak smarter. You need to remove what's unnecessary. Unnecessary words, unnecessary explanations, unnecessary reactions. What remains is clarity. Now imagine your future conversations. You listen more, you speak less, you pause comfortably, you choose words carefully. People start listening differently. Not because you demanded attention, but because your presence invites it. That is the power of talking less. If this audiobook resonated with you, let it change how you move, not just how you speak. Like this, not for the algorithm, but as a reminder to value your words. Leave a comment with a moment that made you rethink how you communicate. Subscribe, not for motivation, but for mastery. And share this with someone who talks too much, not because they're unintelligent, but because they haven't learned the power of silence yet. I'll leave you with one final line. Carry it with you. The smartest person in the room is rarely the one talking the most, but almost always the one everyone listens to. Tell me what audiobook you want next. Part 12. Silence as Self-Respect. There is a moment when silence stops being a tactic and becomes a form of self-respect. You no longer stay quiet to appear intelligent. You stay quiet because your inner world is organized. Smart people don't feel the urge to comment on everything because they don't need external confirmation to feel solid. They are not suppressing opinions. They are selecting where their energy goes. And selection is maturity. Most people speak to relieve pressure. Pressure to be seen, pressure to be included, pressure to prove they belong. Smart people feel that pressure too. But they don't obey it. They let it pass. Because they understand something subtle. Every unnecessary word is a small surrender of self-respect. Now listen carefully. When you stop talking just to fill space, your mind becomes quieter. When your mind becomes quieter, your thoughts sharpen. When your thoughts sharpen, your words become valuable. This is why silence is not emptiness, it's refinement. Now pause. Think about how many conversations you entered where you left feeling slightly drained. Not because the topic was difficult, but because you spoke more than you meant to. Smart people learn to leave conversations with their energy intact. They don't leak themselves everywhere. They respect their inner pace. And that respect is felt by others. Because how you treat your words teaches people how to treat you. Part 13. When people start responding differently to you. Something strange happens when you begin speaking less consistently. People change around you. Not immediately. Not dramatically, subtly. They pause before speaking. They listen longer. They explain themselves more carefully. Not because you demanded respect, but because your presence now carries weight. Smart people never chase this effect. They allow it. Because authority that emerges naturally is stronger than authority that is performed. Now listen closely. When you stop filling silence, others feel responsible for it. They begin to talk more, reveal more, expose more, and you learn more without asking. This is why smart people often know things no one remembers telling them. They were listening while others were speaking freely. Now here's the deeper shift. When you speak less, people stop projecting noise onto you and start projecting depth. They assume you're thinking. They assume you're deliberate. They assume you're aware, even when you say nothing. This is not manipulation, it's perception responding to restraint. Now pause. Imagine walking into a room and feeling no urgency to perform, no pressure to impress, no fear of being overlooked. You observe, you breathe, you stay still. That calm becomes contagious, and people begin orienting toward you. That is quiet influence. In the next message, we bring this journey to its true end, not with technique, but with integration. Part 14. The final stillness. At the end of all this, there is nothing to practice, only something to remember. You were never meant to narrate your intelligence. You were never meant to compete vocally. You were never meant to prove your worth through words. You were meant to think clearly and speak only when clarity adds value. Smart people don't count words. They count alignment. Alignment between thought and speech. Alignment between emotion and response. Alignment between presence and intention. When alignment is there, silence feels natural. Now listen carefully. You don't need to become quieter. You need to become more centered. Quietness follows automatically. When your inner world is stable, you stop rushing to the outside. And when you stop rushing, everything slows down. Your voice, your timing, your life. This is not about being mysterious. It's about being rooted. And rooted people are hard to ignore. Let this audiobook end the right way. Not with more information, but with space. Space to listen more. Space to speak less. Space to trust your presence. Carry this with you. You don't need to be louder to be stronger. You need to be calmer to be clearer. And clarity always speaks for itself. If you want, tell me how many more chapters you want, or the next audiobook topic you want to build next. Part 15. The calm that commands. There is a calm that doesn't ask for attention. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need confirmation. It simply stands. This is the calm smart people grow into. Not because they stopped caring, but because they stopped scattering themselves. They learned that urgency is not importance, that noise is not influence, that speed is not mastery. And once that lesson settles in the body, everything changes. Now listen carefully. When you stop rushing your words, your breath slows. When your breath slows, your thoughts organize. When your thoughts organize, your decisions sharpen. This is not a communication trick. It's a nervous system state. Smart people regulate first, then relate. They don't enter conversations dysregulated. They don't speak from agitation. They don't communicate from hunger for response. They arrive calm. And calm reorganizes rooms. Now pause. Think about the last time someone's presence alone changed how you felt. They didn't say much. They didn't perform confidence. They didn't dominate. They were grounded. That groundedness was felt immediately. That is what talking less eventually becomes. Not silence for effect, but silence as a side effect of stability. Now here's something important. This calm does not make you passive. It makes you precise. When you do speak, you don't waste words. You don't dilute meaning. You don't soften truth unnecessarily. Your words land clean because they come from stillness. Now let me give you a final practice, not a rule. Before you speak, ask silently, does this add clarity or just sound? If it adds clarity, say it. If it adds sound, let it pass. That single filter will transform how people hear you. Now understand this. You don't need to change who you are. You need to remove the noise around who you already are. When the noise fades, intelligence becomes visible, effortlessly, and people respond to you differently, not because you demanded it, but because calm always leads. Carry this with you. Silence is not the absence of power. It is power at rest. And power at rest is what everyone feels before it moves. Part 16. When silence becomes your default. At some point, silence stops feeling like a decision. It becomes your default. Not because you're withdrawn, not because you're hiding, but because you no longer feel pulled outward by everything around you. This is the quiet shift most people never experience. You stop reacting to every comment. You stop needing to add something. You stop feeling late to the conversation. And instead, you arrive already complete. Smart people reach this stage when their inner dialogue becomes stronger than the external noise. They don't need to think out loud anymore. They've already thought things through. Now listen carefully. Most people talk because their thoughts are unfinished. They speak to think. Smart people think first. So when they speak, it's final. That finality is felt. It creates certainty in others, even when the message is simple. Now pause. Think about how often you speak while still forming your opinion. That's normal, but it creates hesitation, backtracking, over-explaining. Smart people wait until the thought settles, then they speak once and move on. Now here's something important. Silence becomes your default only when you stop fearing misinterpretation, when you're okay with being misunderstood temporarily, when you don't rush to correct perceptions, when you trust time to clarify your position. That trust changes everything, because urgency disappears. Now listen closely. Urgency is the enemy of intelligence. It makes you interrupt. It makes you overshare. It makes you react emotionally. Smart people operate without urgency. They don't feel behind. They don't feel pressured. They don't feel chased. They move at their own pace. And pace is power. Now imagine this. You're in a conversation. Someone says something provocative. Everyone looks to you. You don't rush. You pause. You breathe. You respond calmly, or not at all. That moment alone raises your status, because composure is rare, and rarity creates gravity. Now let me give you one more internal rule, not for speaking, but for being. If you feel the urge to speak, pause. If the pause feels uncomfortable, stay there. If clarity doesn't arrive, say nothing. This is not suppression, it's discernment, and discernment is intelligence embodied. Now understand this, you don't become quieter overnight. You become quieter as your life becomes more aligned, as you stop seeking approval, as you stop performing identity, as you stop outsourcing confidence. Silence arrives naturally when you no longer need noise. Carry this final thought with you. When your inner world is steady, your outer world listens. Part 17. The strength of being unavailable. There is a kind of power that doesn't come from dominance. It comes from availability, or the lack of it. Smart people are not always accessible, not emotionally, not verbally, not mentally. And this is not arrogance. It's boundaries expressed through silence. Most people make themselves constantly available. They respond immediately. They engage in every discussion. They comment on every issue. They explain every absence. And slowly, their presence loses value. Smart people don't do this. They allow space between themselves and the world. That space creates gravity. Now listen carefully. When you are always available, your words feel cheap. When you are selectively available, your words feel considered. Smart people don't rush to respond because they don't feel obligated to prove attentiveness. They know attentiveness is felt, not announced. Now pause. Think about people whose words you value most. They're not the ones who respond instantly to everything. They're not the loudest. They're not constantly present. Their presence is intentional, and intentional presence feels powerful. Now, let's talk about emotional availability. Smart people don't emotionally react to every stimulus. They don't let moods pull them around. They don't mirror chaos. They don't absorb other people's urgency. They stay grounded. That grounding makes others feel regulated around them, and people gravitate toward regulation. Now listen closely. Being unavailable does not mean being distant. It means being selective. You choose when to engage, what to respond to, how deeply to invest. This selection preserves energy. Preserved energy sharpens intelligence. Now imagine this. Someone tries to provoke you. Instead of reacting, you pause. Instead of defending, you stay quiet. Instead of escalating, you disengage. The situation dissolves, not because you were weak, but because you didn't feed it. Smart people starve unnecessary conflict. They don't entertain it. Now here's a line worth carrying. Not every invitation deserves your presence. Not every question deserves your answer. Smart people live by this, and slowly, the world adjusts to them. People speak more carefully. People explain themselves more. People listen more closely, because your silence trained them to. In the next chapter, we go even deeper. Why smart people don't fear being underestimated, and how underestimation quietly becomes an advantage. This is where restraint turns into strategy. Part 18. The advantage of being underestimated. Most people are afraid of being underestimated. They rush to correct it. They talk more. They explain more. They prove more. Smart people do the opposite. They let it happen. Because being underestimated is one of the greatest strategic advantages you can have. Now listen carefully. When people underestimate you, they relax. They reveal. They stop guarding their words. They assume control. And in that moment, they give you information, leverage, and time. Smart people don't interrupt this process. They observe. They let others speak freely. They let assumptions form. They let expectations stay low. And while others perform, smart people prepare. Now pause. Think about how often you feel the urge to show people who you really are. That urge comes from ego, not strength. Smart people don't need to announce capability. They let outcomes do that work. Now here's the psychological truth. When you talk less, people project less certainty onto you. They fill the gaps themselves. And once people commit to an assumption, they stop questioning it. That's where advantage lives. Now listen closely. Smart people don't rush to be recognized. They allow results to surprise. Surprise carries more weight than anticipation. Now imagine this. You stay quiet. You stay observant. You don't argue perceptions. You don't correct narratives. Then one day, you act. And the room recalibrates instantly. That recalibration is powerful because it doesn't come from words. It comes from contrast. Now let me say this clearly. Trying to control how people see you is exhausting. Letting them underestimate you is efficient. Smart people conserve energy for action, not image management. Now think about this line. Those who speak early explain later. Those who stay quiet act once. Smart people prefer acting once. Now listen carefully. Underestimation removes pressure. When expectations are low, you can move freely. Experiment, think, adapt. High expectations trap people. Low expectations free them. Smart people choose freedom. Now here's the deeper layer. When you don't rush to defend your intelligence, you stop tying your identity to other people's opinions. That independence is rare. And rarity commands respect. In the next chapter, we move toward closure. Not an ending, an internal settling. Why smart people don't need to dominate rooms? Because they dominate themselves first.